The mayor called him a radical immigrant. Live on air. No hesitation, no retraction. Just 2 words spit with the casual sharpness of someone used to being listened to. I watched it twice, first to hear it, second to believe it, because he wasn't talking about a protester. He wasn't talking about a violent threat. He was talking about Zohran Mamdani, a state assemblyman and elected official. A man born in Uganda, raised in New York, whose biggest crime, apparently, was caring too much about where American money went after it left our hands. He's dangerous, the mayor said, because he refuses to play by the rules. Now, I don't know about you, but when a man who once served as a police officer starts calling immigrants dangerous for asking questions, my alarm bells don't just ring. They scream. Here's what made this worse. Mamdani didn't yell back. He didn't stage a press conference. He didn't go on CNN. He just sat there, at a local community hearing, hands folded, silent. I remember the camera cutting in slow zoom on his fingers. They were still. No twitch, no defensiveness, just stillness. I've seen that posture before. It's not fear, it's grief. And right then I had to pause, because it hit me. They weren't attacking his politics. They were erasing his story. See, Zohran didn't come from wealth. He didn't come from power. He didn't even come from a stable roof. He came from a rooftop, literally. When his family first landed in New York, they were too broke for rent. So they lived in a borrowed rooftop shed, 1 mattress, 1 extension cord, 1 cold winter that made him swear he'd never feel powerless again. But now, decades later, with a microphone in front of him and a title behind his name here, he was again facing power and choosing not to flinch. Now, why does that matter? Because there's a lie we've been fed in this country that the louder man wins, that shouting is strength, that silence is weakness. But that night, Zohran Mamdani said more by saying nothing than any podium ever could. He didn't defend his roots. He didn't beg for acceptance. He let them call him a radical. Because sometimes, the truth is radical. Caring is radical. Believing Palestinians deserve dignity, radical. Asking where your tax dollars go when children die, radical. And loving a country enough to question it. Apparently, radical too. You want to know what's actually dangerous? It's not a young man standing up for people half a world away. It's a mayor with cameras rolling trying to make 1 immigrant stand in for every fear they want you to feel. But here's what the mayor forgot. Zohran Mamdani isn't alone. He's not the only child of refugees who remembers sleeping cold. He's not the only New Yorker who's ever been told you don't belong. And he damn sure isn't the only American who thinks questioning power is the most American thing you can do. So call him radical. Label him. Discredit him. But remember this. The first night he arrived in this country, he slept under a plastic sheet, on a rooftop, in the dead of winter. And when you've already lived through that, you don't get shaken by a man in a suit yelling your name on TV. The first night in America, Zohran Mamdani didn't see the skyline. He saw tar. He felt the wind leaking through the slats of the rooftop shed his mother had begged someone to borrow. He was 7. The floor beneath him wasn't floor. It was layered cardboard. An extension cord ran from the window below them to power a space heater that coughed more than it warmed. Their walls were insulation panels nailed unevenly by a church janitor who said God sees the humble first. They weren't homeless, not in the official sense. But what do you call a place where a child wakes up shivering every hour just to check if the heater's still alive? What do you call a home where you share boiled eggs by candlelight because the circuit can't handle a microwave? Zohran never called it poor. He called it temporary. Because that's what his mother told him, temporary baby. Temporary is how we all begin in America. She believed it. So did he. And maybe that belief was what kept him warm. School was different. School was fluorescent lighting and steel trays. It was teachers mispronouncing his name and kids asking if his mother wore bedsheets. It was the first time he lied about his address, said Apt 5B instead of rooftop storage unit. It was safer that way. But even then, he carried something. A folder inside the first government form he ever tried to fill out. It wasn't his. It was for a man named Karim, a neighbor from the floor below. Karim had overstayed his visa and couldn't read English. So Zohran tried. spelling out asylum clauses in pencil, asking his teacher what pending review meant without giving away why he needed to know. Karim didn't get to stay, but he left the folder with Zohran. "You might need this someday," he'd said. Zohran kept it, moved it from that rooftop to a tiny one-bedroom, to a studio apartment above a laundromat, and later to a dorm room with peeling posters of revolutionaries. That folder followed him everywhere, because he needed the weight of it, the reminder that his story didn't begin in debates or budgets. It began in the spaces America forgets, with a mattress on a rooftop, with a mother who believed the system would eventually see her son as more than foreign. But systems don't see people. People do. And for most of his life, Zohran wasn't seen. He was tolerated. That changed when he ran for office. Not because he suddenly mattered, but because he refused to be quiet. He talked about housing like someone who once didn't have any. He talked about immigration like someone whose hands had once fumbled with a green card under flickering light. And voters listened. Maybe because they were tired of polished smiles and vague answers. Or maybe because deep down they remembered being cold once too. When he won, he brought the folder to Albany, placed it in the drawer of his office desk. Not for show, for memory. Because he never wanted to forget where his voice came from. Not the classroom, not the campaign, but the rooftop. That night when the mayor called him radical, it wasn't just an insult. It was erasure, an attempt to rewrite the beginning, to paint a man who'd once begged for a heater as some kind of threat. But here's what the mayor didn't understand. When you've had your silence mistaken for weakness your whole life, your stillness becomes the sharpest blade you carry. Zohran didn't need to yell back. He didn't need to remind anyone where he came from. Because some stories don't need defending. They just need remembering. The camera caught his silence. Not his words, not his record. Just the moment he didn't speak. And that silence, it was used like a weapon. It was the Wednesday City Hall press conference. Mayor Eric Adams stood at the podium, flanked by law enforcement brass and budget advisors. The topic was funding for NYPD's Strategic Counterterrorism Unit, a unit Zohran Mamdani had publicly questioned, citing disproportionate policing in immigrant communities. But Adams wasn't there to argue policy. He was there to draw a line, a cultural one. There are people, he said, slow, deliberate, looking straight into the lens, elected into our government, funded by radical interests who question whether America even has the right to defend itself. He paused. The room held its breath. "You know who I'm talking about." And he smiled. That smile practiced tight cold. The reporters didn't ask who. They didn't need to. By that evening, local news anchors were already running with it. Is Assemblyman Mamdani too extreme for New York flashed across the screen? B-roll played of Zohran at a protest for Gaza standing in front of a ceasefire now banner, out of context. Without audio, without nuance, just image, just silence. They didn't show the minutes before that shot, where Mamdani read the names of children under 12 who had died in airstrikes. They didn't show his voice cracking on the name Mariam. They didn't show the mothers in the crowd weeping. Just the still shot, the brown man, the banner, the word radical, and then came the commentary. He refuses to condemn terrorism. He's more loyal to the Middle East than to New York. He's anti-American. Online forums erupted. Fox News did a segment, New York's terror-tied lawmaker. The framing wasn't subtle. Neither was the threat. And all this storm of fury and implication was built on one thing. The fact that when Zohran was asked if Israel's bombardment should be classified as a war crime, he didn't answer. He paused. He breathed. And in that pause, 1,000 pundits found their villain. But what none of them saw, what the camera didn't catch, was why he paused. Because behind him, in that moment, a teenage girl in hijab had collapsed. Heat stroke, crowd tension, shock. Mamdani had seen her fall just as the question was asked. His eyes flicked toward her. His hand went to his pocket for water, and in that split second the media decided he was dodging. But the moment wasn't lost on everyone. One man in the crowd saw the whole thing. Later, he posted a blurry clip from his phone. You could just make out Mamdani crouching beside the girl pouring water into her hands, whispering something, waving for a medic. No headlines picked it up. No corrections were made. Because outrage doesn't like nuance. And silence is dangerous. Especially when it belongs to someone who isn't supposed to have a voice. In City Hall the next week, Mamdani entered to glares. The mayor's aides whispered as he passed. One security guard smirked and muttered terror rep under his breath. He heard it, didn't flinch. He took his seat, opened his folder, reviewed the housing resolution for East Elmhurst like it was any other day. Because that's what they don't expect. They expect fire. They expect you to break. They don't expect quiet dignity. They don't expect stillness. They don't expect you to keep doing the work. So Zohran did. And while the headlines screamed, and the talk shows howled, and the tweets piled up like ash over truth, he kept showing up. Town halls, budget sessions, constituents in need. Because when you've lived on a rooftop in winter, political heat doesn't scare you. And when you've held your mother's hand in the immigration line, no man in a suit can make you question your place here. Eric Adams fired his shot. The media carried the echo. But Zohran, he let the silence speak. Because sometimes the loudest answer is the one you don't give. The question came from a retired firefighter. 65 years old, born in Queens, the kind of man who'd seen too much smoke and too many broken promises. It was a community forum in Woodside, modest room, plastic chairs, half-full coffee urns, and a microphone that crackled every fourth word. Zohran Mamdani was seated on a folding chair, one of 7 panelists mostly ignored, until the final question. Do you even love this country? The firefighter didn't shout. He asked it the way people ask about your family, when they don't think you've called your mother in too long, disappointed, suspicious, but still open to being proven wrong. The room fell silent. Mamdani adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, and then instead of defending, explaining, rebutting, he told a story. First night we landed at JFK, my mom had $108 in her purse. The shelter said we had to wait 48 hours. A friend of a friend gave us a key to a rooftop storage shed. He paused. People shifted in their seats. It was winter. There was a crack in the roof. I remember it because that crack made a whistling sound. I used to think it was singing. A few chuckles. I was 7. That night my mom made me promise not to cry, because if the neighbor downstairs heard us, they might tell the super and we'd be thrown out. A woman near the back covered her mouth with her hand. I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling and thought, one day I'm going to buy her a heater that doesn't make noise. The room exhaled one of those shared releases where everyone's lungs remember something heavy at the same time. Mamdani leaned forward. You ask if I love this country? Pause. I ask you, what do you call it when a woman gives up her home, her language, her family, sleeps on a rooftop with her child, just so he can one day raise his hand and say, I served the state of New York. His voice didn't rise. It dipped. I don't carry a flag in my lapel because I carry it in my mother's hands. No applause, just stillness. Then the firefighter stood, walked up, shook Mamdani's hand. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. That story traveled. It didn't trend on Twitter. It didn't make the front page. But it passed through living rooms, dinner tables, WhatsApp groups. A story not about politics. About belonging. About a boy who stayed silent because his mother asked him to be invisible, and who grew up to use that same silence like armor. The next time Mamdani walked into City Hall, one of the guards nodded. Not a smirk, not a whisper, a nod. Respect. Because something had shifted. Not the narrative, not the media, but the people. They started asking different questions. Instead of, is he a radical, it became, where's he speaking next? Instead of, why doesn't he condemn it, became, why haven't we listened? And that was the unexpected turn. Mamdani didn't fight fire with fire. He didn't shout louder than the mayor. He told a story. And that story, quiet, steady human, did what anger never could. It reminded people what this country is supposed to be. A place where a 7-year-old boy can listen to a roof whistle and believe the sound means something. It was a school gymnasium in Jackson Heights. Cafeteria tables pushed to the walls, folding chairs in uneven rows. The walls still smelled faintly of disinfectant and crayons. Mamdani had been invited by a local teacher to speak with 6th graders about public service. Nothing formal, no cameras, just a Kiwanda with curious minds who still believed in the magic of elected officials. But the moment that changed everything didn't come from a teacher. It came from a girl in a lavender hoodie, barely 11, clutching a spiral notebook to her chest like it was armor. She raised her hand. "Are you mad when they call you names on TV?" The room got quiet. The teacher moved to intervene, but Mamdani held up his hand gently. He looked at the girl and smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "but not for the reason you might think." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper. Yellowed. Edges curled. The kind of paper that has been opened and closed so many times it stops lying flat. "I want to show you something." He opened it slowly, held it up like a relic. "This is the first thing I ever tried to write in English, by myself." The kids leaned in. "It's a letter I wrote for our neighbor Karim. He was going to be deported. He didn't know the words to ask for help. He held it like it might break. So I tried." The girl squinted. "What happened?" Mamdani took a breath. "They sent him back. But before he left, he told me you might need this someday. Don't forget what it means to try." He folded the paper again, tucked it back into his pocket like a priest returning a relic to his robes. "I carry it with me to every meeting, not because it changes laws, but because it reminds me why I care." One boy raised his hand. "What does it say?" Mamdani smiled again. "It says to whom it may concern this man is not bad. He is good to my family. Please let him stay." A teacher in the back wiped her eye. The kids didn't laugh. They didn't whisper. They sat in the silence like it was holy. And in that moment, Mamdani realized something. The thing they called weakness. The pause, the emotion, the memory was his greatest weapon. Not because it won arguments, but because it made erasure impossible. Eric Adams could call him radical. The news could spin his silence into scandal. But no one, not one soul, could rewrite that letter. No one could take it from the hands of a boy trying to save his neighbor. No one could erase the night his mother whispered, "Don't cry, baby," as wind screamed through the rooftop walls. And no one could silence the soft but unshakable truth that this country was built not just by power, but by people who believed in it enough to write letters that might never be read. That day after the school visit, a staffer snapped a photo of Mamdani walking out with the notebook still in his hand. The caption later read, "He didn't come to teach politics. He came to teach memory." And it stuck. It spread. Because memory isn't just personal, it's contagious. It reminds us of what matters. And in a world spinning with noise, sometimes a crumpled letter in a pocket says more than any press release ever could. The chamber was packed. The state assembly floor mid-budget season. Suits packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras rolling, journalists perched in the balcony, tension so thick it hung between the desks like fog. This was supposed to be routine. A debate over police funding, line items and legalese. But nothing was routine anymore, because Zohran Mamdani had requested the floor. No prepared remarks, no teleprompters. Just a quiet motion and a nod from the speaker. He stood, straightened his jacket, and then without notes, without warning, he began. "I'd like to read something," he said. "It's not a budget clause. It's from a different document." Some looked confused. Others looked worried. He unfolded a slip of paper and began. "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. A beat. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." His voice didn't rise. It deepened. "That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He folded the paper, pocketed it, then looked up. "I was taught those words on my second day of school in this country." Murmurs. He let them settle. "I didn't understand all of it. I didn't know what unalienable meant. I thought it had something to do with aliens. I was 7. Light laughter quickly silenced. But I remembered how my teacher said it like it was sacred. Like she needed us to believe it more than we believed in anything else." He stepped forward slightly. "Now I stand here 30 years later being called anti-American for asking how we spend our money. For wondering if some lives, some children deserve our compassion even if they don't live here." A pause. "Let me say this clearly. If loving America means accepting silence in the face of suffering, then I am not a patriot." Eyes widened. "If believing in dignity for all people makes me radical, then I welcome the title. He scanned the room. I did not come to this chamber to be palatable. I came to be honest. Another pause. You want to question my loyalty. I'll tell you where it lies. It lies with my mother, who gave up everything just so I could sit here. It lies with the neighbors who watched over us when we had no walls. It lies with a boy who wrote a letter he wasn't sure would ever be read. And yes, it lies with the people of Gaza, whose names we never say, whose funerals never make our screens, whose suffering we fund in silence. Murmurs again, sharper this time. He raised his hand. I don't say this to accuse, I say this to remember. Because what is a budget if not a moral document? And what is a leader if not someone brave enough to ask where our morals go when the money moves? Then he stepped back, sat down. No applause, no objection, just stillness, the kind that sinks into skin and doesn't leave. That night the clip was played on every major news network. But it wasn't the words that made it viral. It was the silence that followed. No one yelled, no one rebutted. No one dared, because Zohran Mamdani hadn't shouted them down. He'd held a mirror, and for the first time, they saw not a radical, but a reminder that patriotism isn't about loyalty to power. It's about loyalty to people, even the ones we never meet, even the ones we never save, even the ones who for a moment breathe through our silence. It was a Wednesday, overcast, damp, the kind of day where New York smelled like wet concrete and yesterday's coffee. Mamdani was scheduled to appear at a local community board meeting in Queens. Nothing glamorous, no press, just agenda items about crosswalks and zoning ordinances, until an elderly man stood up in the back row. No name tag, no introduction. He leaned on a cane that looked older than some of the board members, eyes sharp beneath a frayed kufi cap, voice soft but steady. "Excuse me," he said, pointing toward Mamdani. "I know him." The room paused. He was 8, maybe 9. I was his neighbor, Karim. A tremor passed through Mamdani's face, recognition, disbelief, and something else. Reverence. I was the man he wrote that letter for. Gasps, whispers. The moderator tried to move the agenda forward, but the man raised his cane slightly, and somehow everyone froze again. I never forgot him. Never forgot the night he slipped that paper under my door. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a plastic sleeve. Inside the same letter. Faded, creased, still legible. The handwriting unmistakably that of a child. The room was silent. He spelled residence wrong, Karim said, smiling. Wrote it as residence. But the message was clear. He turned to the board. This young man, this radical you talk about, he tried to save me when no one else would. When he couldn't even tie his own shoes right, he stood between me and deportation. The moderator tried again. Karim waved him off. One more thing. He faced Mamdani. I spent 15 years in Pakistan after they sent me back. I came back legally 5 years ago. Applied, waited, prayed. And when I got my citizenship last year, the first letter I wrote was to him. He paused. He didn't respond. He probably thought it was spam. Laughter. Real human disarming. I came here today because I needed you to know. The boy who fought for me became the man I needed him to be. He looked around. I don't know much about budgets or politics, but I know this: if you have someone in power who remembers where they came from, you hold on to them. He sat down. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The moment didn't ask for applause. It demanded memory. After the meeting, someone uploaded the footage. Not polished, shaky, poor audio, but it didn't matter. Because the internet doesn't always care about quality. Sometimes it just wants truth. The video spread. People watched, shared, cried. Former students, social workers, civic leaders, immigrants who'd never seen their stories told by anyone who looked like them until now. Local radio picked it up. Then the nightly news. Then national outlets. They didn't lead with the usual buzzwords. They led with the letter. And just like that, the narrative shifted. Mamdani was no longer controversial. He was human, not because of his policies, but because someone remembered him. And in that memory, others found permission to remember their own stories, their own rooftop nights, their own boys with too much hope and not enough heat. The media tried to pivot, but the wave had already started. One woman wrote, "My father was deported when I was 12. No one fought for him. Zohran would have." A man tweeted, "I've disagreed with Mamdani's politics, but you can't fake what I saw in that room." Karim never gave another speech. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. That even in exile, memory survives. That even in silence, letters get read. That even in a world that tries to erase the truth can find its way back wrinkled, yes, but intact. And that sometimes the witness you never knew you'd need shows up. Exactly when the world needs reminding of who you really are. The council chamber was humming. Not loud. Not yet. But that thick kind of murmur that means a storm is coming. Mayor Eric Adams sat at the center table flanked by aides and public safety officials. Papers stacked neatly, tie knotted with surgical precision, a man prepared to defend every dollar. The hearing was about police allocation increases, but everyone knew it would be more than that. This was the showdown. Mamdani sat across the aisle, alone. No team, no notes. Just the same folder, the one with the letter worn and folded tucked into the inside pocket of his blazer. He knew what Adams would say. He was ready. What he didn't know was how hard it would be to stay still. The mayor went first. "Let me be clear," Adams said, his voice sharp, controlled. "We live in a time of threat, a time where bad actors use platforms to push division, to weaken us from within." He turned subtle, direct. "We have people right here in this room who question our values, who weaponize grief to undermine our law enforcement, who defend the indefensible abroad while criticizing the defenders at home." Every eye turned to Mamdani. Adams leaned forward. "This is not a time for silence," he said. "Silence is complicity. If you stand here in this city and refuse to denounce terror, then you are not a leader." The room broke into murmurs. A council member nodded. Another smirked. But Mamdani, he didn't move, didn't flinch. He waited. Then calmly he stood, walked to the center podium. No papers, no preamble, just presence. "Mr. Mayor," he began softly, "you're right." The room froze. Silence is complicity. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a document protector, inside a scan of a refugee application. The ink smudged. The header stamped "Received." "This," he said, holding it up, "is my mother's asylum form. The first time she asked this country for mercy." He laid it gently on the table. This is what silence looked like then. Because no one answered. No one replied. For 2 years we waited without knowing if we would be allowed to stay. He looked up, and yet we did not become bitter. We became citizens, not just of a nation, but of its ideals. He placed a second page on the table. The letter. Karim's. "My first act of public service was writing this. Not for applause, not for politics. Just so one man might stay." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You say I do not denounce terror." He paused. "I denounce any hand that takes innocent life. I denounce any policy that funds that hand. I denounce silence in the face of suffering wherever it lives." He stepped back, faced the mayor directly. "But I will not denounce my humanity, or the humanity of those you refuse to see." A councilwoman whispered, "Damn," Mamdani continued. "If you believe that grief is only valid when it speaks your language, then we have failed. If you believe that patriotism means blind allegiance, then we have forgotten who we are." He gathered the documents, held them close. "I was 7 when I learned that documents don't guarantee dignity. But dignity, when spoken aloud, can shame even the most powerful into memory." He turned to leave, paused. "I will not outyell you, Mr. Mayor. I will not match your fire. But I will outlast your fear." The room didn't erupt. It hushed. The way churches do after prayers that sound too much like truth. The hearing continued. Budgets were debated. Votes were cast. But something had changed. Because when a man brings his mother's refugee papers to the table and says nothing more than "remember," that's not politics. That's legacy. It started small. A voicemail from a woman in Buffalo. She didn't leave her name, just a tremble. "My son, he looks like you. I never thought he'd see someone like him speak like that. Thank you." Then came the emails. From cab drivers, teachers, grocery clerks. "I used to keep my head down. I never told anyone I was undocumented. I thought I had to apologize for being here. But now, They were writing letters, not to protest, to remember, because something in Zohran's stand reminded them of something they'd almost forgotten. That to be American doesn't mean being born here. It means choosing here. It means choosing it even when it doesn't choose you back. A janitor in Long Island wrote, "I came in 92, cleaned schools, subways, hospitals. Never once heard my story in a suit. You said it for all of us." A teacher from the Bronx wrote, "My parents were deported when I was 16. I buried their letters in a shoebox. I dug them out after watching your speech." The most powerful messages didn't come from the loudest voices. They came from the margins, the forgotten, the labeled, the ones called too brown, too foreign, too radical. They came from fathers who had stopped believing their kids would ever be seen, from mothers who kept legal forms in Ziplocs under mattresses, from children who learned to stay quiet in the cafeteria because their lunch looked different. And suddenly those same children were writing essays titled, "What Patriotism Means to Me," not about flags, about rooftops, about mothers, about the silence that taught them how to speak. Mamdani didn't respond to every letter. He didn't have to, because this wasn't about him anymore. He had become a vessel, a mirror, proof that memory, when wielded with grace, could become a movement, not a protest, a remembering of everything we've tried to erase. A restaurant owner in Queens hung a printout of the speech behind his counter. Next to it, a photo of his father in the uniform of a janitor at JFK. He told his teenage sons, "This is who we are, not because we're in office, but because we remember." And that was the moral payoff. Not vindication, not victory, recognition. That every act of courage echoes, every whispered story, every folded letter, every child who dared to try matters. That patriotism isn't loyalty to comfort, it's loyalty to truth, to dignity, to each other. And suddenly, Mamdani wasn't the radical. He was the reminder that this country's greatest promise wasn't perfection. It was memory, and the courage to speak it out loud, even when your voice shakes, especially then. It was never just about Zohran. It was about the quiet things, the stories we buried, the names we stopped saying, the truth we whispered to our children when we weren't sure if this country had room for it. In the weeks after his speech, the letters didn't stop. But something else happened too. People started speaking at PTA meetings, in church basements, on subway platforms between stops where strangers locked eyes and suddenly felt seen. A retired Marine in Staten Island stood at his VFW hall and said, "I didn't fight for silence. I fought so people like him could speak." A Palestinian-American poet in Detroit published a piece titled, "The Radical is a Boy with a Folder." It was shared 2 million times. A 9th grader in Texas recorded a TikTok about her father's asylum story, a story she'd never had the courage to tell before. "I didn't think anyone would care," she said, "but then I saw someone who sounded like us. And he wasn't afraid." It spread like wildfire. Not outrage, belonging. The thing we all pretend we don't need but quietly ache for. And as it did, it forced a reckoning. Not just in politics. In us. What do we owe the people who carry our memory? What does it say about us when we try to erase the messiest stories, the ones that made us who we are? Zohran didn't have all the answers. He never claimed to. He just kept showing up. Not to lead. To listen. To remember out loud so others could too. At a neighborhood vigil for victims of war overseas, a little girl handed him a drawing. It showed a bear holding a tiny roof. Underneath, "Thank you for being brave for people like my dad." Mamdani didn't speak that night. He just held the drawing and smiled, because that's what it meant now. It wasn't about shouting louder. It was about becoming the kind of silence that holds, not hides, the kind that shelters, the kind that makes room. And that's what it meant to us. To the ones called foreign, to the ones who held their breath at customs, to the ones whose parents worked 2 jobs and never once complained because they believed America was a place where their children might be heard. It meant we could stop asking for permission to belong. It meant we could start remembering unapologetically. It meant we could take the stories we'd hidden in drawers, in folders in the back of our minds, and lay them gently, powerfully in the middle of the room. It meant we were no longer alone, not because of a politician, but because of a mirror. Because finally, someone had held up the memory and said, "This is American too," and we believed him. So now, what will you do with this? Not the video, not the speech, not the clip you might have bookmarked or the quote you underlined, but the feeling, the moment, the memory. Because that's what this was always about. Not about politics, not about left or right, not even about Zohran Mamdani. This was about you, and the stories you've buried, the names you stopped saying, the silences you thought made you small when they were actually your power. What will you do with that silence now? Will you tuck it away again? Or will you let it become a question, a stand, a whisper someone else desperately needs to hear? Because someone is watching, a child, a neighbor, a woman balancing 2 jobs and a prayer. They are watching, waiting for someone to speak the truth with the kind of quiet that cannot be misquoted, not shouted, not spun, just held, like a letter in a folder, like a voice on the verge, like a memory we no longer apologize for. You don't have to run for office. You don't have to write laws. You just have to remember, out loud, at dinner, at school, on the bus, in the places where someone taught you once that your story didn't matter here. Tell it anyway, because your story is the crack in the rooftop that whistles like a lullaby. It's the paper slipped under a neighbor's door. It's the stillness that forces the world to stop. And listen, we live in noisy times. Everyone's shouting. Everyone's branding. Everyone's begging to be heard. But maybe, just maybe, the most radical thing you can do right now is to remember softly, to speak gently, to stand firmly, and to never again let anyone tell you that your silence means you weren't there, that your accent means you don't belong, that your story, if painful, must be political. Because it isn't. It's yours. And like Zohran's, it's enough. So here's the call. Don't share this for likes. Don't quote it for clout. Live it, in quiet courage, in honest memory, in the space between what was whispered and what still needs to be said. Because someone somewhere is still cold on a rooftop, still waiting to know they're seen. And your story, your truth might be the first warm thing they ever hear. Don't let it go silent. Not now. Not ever.